Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
Hello, and welcome to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm Ed Beimfohr, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Professor Christopher Corbett, who is a professor of journalism here at UMBC. Chris, I know that you have been both a reporter and an editor for the Associated Press. I know that you've written for a number of prestigious periodicals, and are of course also the author of the book that is the main event here today, kind of Orphans Preferred, The Twisted Truth and Lasting Legend of the Pony Express. Chris, why don't you tell us a little more about your background?
Well, I was a journalist for 20 years, primarily a reporter and an editor with the Associated Press. Before that, I worked for daily and weekly newspapers. And after I left the AP, I worked as a travel writer for a syndicate and for the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I've done lots of different kinds of journalism, magazine work. And I'm also a published novelist. I'm published by Viking Penguin. But this was a book-length work that came out of a piece of journalism that I was doing in the West. Right. And I sort of stumbled on the Pony Express, as many a chronicler of the Pony Express has before me. And
there have been some.
There were quite a number of them. And the thing about the story of the Pony Express is a story that the more you know about the story of the Pony Express, the more you know that what you don't know, it's a confusing tale. Maybe the more you know, the less you know. It's a piece of American history that is much beloved, but it is rooted in fact and layered with a century and a half of fabrication and embellishment and outright lies. The pony will be 150 years old in April of 2010. And its story has just become livelier and larger as time goes by. I often tell people it's a bit of a fishing story, that the fish just gets a little bigger every year. The reality of the Pony Express is that the Pony Express was an independent private venture designed to move mail across the United States, which began on the 3rd of April in 1860. And it only lasted for 78 weeks. For all practical purposes, it ceased to operate on or about the 26th of October, 1861. Everything's a little vague because the company that owned the Pony Express, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, they were a big freight hauling company in the American West, did not keep the greatest records in the world for a variety of reasons, so we can get into that. But the reality of the Pony is they were only in business a very short time. They hemorrhaged money from the day they started, never made a dime, lost a lot of money. The owners almost went to jail. But in memory, it's a beloved, iconic piece of the Old West.
And as I read the book, and I might add, it's a great read, very enjoyable to read. It obviously, it embodies, it captures a lot of the American spirit.
Right.
And has come to symbolize the opening of the West and so on. How did this this episode in history come to your attention? And tell us about the research that went into building a book like this.
Well, part of the story of the Pony is to understand that in 1860, because of the California gold rush, there were now suddenly 500,000 Americans were living on the Pacific slope, and whereas it had only been a few hundred before the discovery of gold. Before James Marshall kicked up gold on the American River in 1848, hardly anybody lived in California, and California had only very recently been actually Mexico. So anyway, so you have 500,000 people living on the Pacific slope, and between the Missouri River, St. Joseph, Missouri, which is where the Pony Express started, and the Pacific slope, you have roughly 2,000 miles of what Alexander Majors, one of the owners of the Pony, called a wild and uninhabited expanse, and that is not hyperbolic. There was no one really living out there except a few trappers, and some Mormons were settled at Salt Lake. But other than that, large sections of the American West were lunar.
Right.
No one was there.
Wilderness.
Right.
And not to mention 2 mountain ranges,
Yeah.
the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada.
Well, I was doing a piece of journalism, because I still do a lot of work like that, and I was in Nevada, and it was a Sunday, and I didn't have anything to do, and I had a rental car, and I saw on a road map it said Pony Express Station. Now, I knew absolutely nothing about the Pony Express, but I thought, well, why not? So I drove down into the desert. I couldn't find the Pony Express station, so I stopped at this gas station, and they said, yes, well, it's down, and you've got to be careful, you know, you don't step on a snake. And so I went back into the desert, and there was this Pony Express station. Now, in Nevada, where it rarely rains, and the absence of rain prevents things from disintegrating, you have pretty much existing a Pony Express station from the 19th century, as it would have been in the days of Russell, Majors, and Waddell. So I looked at this station, and I was thinking about the Pony, and I knew nothing about it at all. And when I came back east, back to Baltimore, I started to look into the subject just out of curiosity. I'm not an historian, I'm a journalist. And what occurred to me was that the more I read about the Pony from what books there were available, the more I realized that this was really the story of an American whopper. This was a tall tale, a little bit like Paul Revere's Ride, or Johnny Appleseed, or Paul Bunyan, one of those things that sort of is true, but then gets spun out into things that aren't even remotely resembling the truth.
It takes on a life of its own, as it were.
Yeah. Also, an interesting thing about looking at the story of the Pony Express is that while the Pony was only in business for 78 weeks, almost a half a century went by before anyone wrote a book-length work about the Pony Express. And the author of that book was a man named Colonel William Lightfoot Vischer, who was a larger-than-life character, a newspaper man in the American West. His legal address for many years was the bar at the Chicago Press Club. And the Colonel was a person who truly did not let the facts get in the way of the story.
Right.
When he got done, no one was entirely sure what the truth was.
What exactly had happened.
Right. He was probably the great primary embellisher, you might say, of the story of the Pony. And he put a lot of stuff in the book, his book, that has nothing to do with the Pony Express at all. But the Colonel sort of got the ball rolling. This was 1907 or 1908, so you think about this. This is nearly 50 years since the actual event has occurred. Now, there were people alive at the turn of the century and really into the 1920s and 30s who had known the Pony Express and had been involved with it. But the Colonel didn't do what we would consider conventional research. He tended to repeat a lot of whoppers, and the Pony was the source of a tremendous number of whoppers because it was this magnificent image of the Wild West. You know, a young man on the back of a horse crossing the country, and this is.
And let's touch on that for a minute, if we can, Chris. As I read the book, I was taken with the enormity of the whole idea of the Pony Express.
Right.
I have, as we have talked previously, I have spent some time on horseback. I have spent some time backpacking up and around the Sierra Nevada. It's very rough country. And the idea that a series of riders could traverse from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, cross 2 mountain ranges, deal with perhaps Indians, who knows, other kinds of banditos that might be out there after that mail pouch, and yet take that on and do it successfully is no mean feat. That's truly a staggering accomplishment.
It is a staggering accomplishment. The thing itself is the Pony Express succeeded in moving a piece of mail, which is what it started to do. Its intention was to move a piece of mail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, those were the points where the telegraph line ended, roughly 2,000 miles, in 10 days' time or less, using a series of relays. Young, wiry men who weren't very heavy, light in the saddle, on a good horse. And you would ride 10, 12, 15 miles tops, and then the mailbag would go on to another rider.
Right.
And by doing this relay, and they were riding 24/7, night and day, you don't really need to ride that fast. The object is to just keep the mail moving.
Right.
And if you do the math on that, it's not such a complicated thing. What complicates the equation is the kind of thing you're referring to. You've got to cross mountains in the winter. 30 feet of snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains.
And there was a real
time.
question as to whether this route was viable.
Right, yes. The business was put together very quickly. It did not involve the kind of planning that we might use for the space program or something. Remember, this is a private venture. It was put together fast. In the eastern end of the line, the pony went out of St. Joseph, Missouri. You immediately crossed the Missouri River. And then it rode out into Kansas about 100 miles straight. And then it hooked off north, crossed the Little Blue River into Nebraska, and then crossed Nebraska, basically running to the south bank of the Platte River.
Platte River, yeah.
Clipped a corner of Colorado, back into Nebraska, and then up what would be Scotts Bluff in western Nebraska, and then on into Wyoming. Crossed Wyoming, then down into Utah through what is today Salt Lake City, and then 700 miles of lunar landscape in Utah and Nevada to cross the Sierra Nevada, again, actually quite near the resort of Tahoe. They went right through what is today Tahoe, then on down into Sacramento. Some of the terrain is more hospitable than other parts. Obviously, it's not particularly difficult to ride a horse across Kansas as opposed to riding a horse at night in the Sierra Nevada in January. So a lot of this had to do with the terrain. It was an enormously expensive operation. That's the other thing people don't realize. You had to have stations every 10 or 15 miles. These had to be staffed. You had to hire people to do this. You had to often supply them. Horses were expensive.
Good ones.
Right, and that was a major factor which people often don't consider, is that the riders were well mounted because the people who ran this business realized that it was imperative to keep the mail moving. In fact, the British explorer Richard Burton, who is one of the people who tells us a lot about the Pony Express because he actually saw the pony. He was traveling around in the American West at the time. He says that in Utah and Nevada, what would be Utah and Nevada today, that the station keepers brought the horses into the station at night and made the men sleep outside because the horses were more valuable than the men were.
Well, let's share with our viewers a first-person account of one of the more legendary rides done by Pony Bob Haslam.
Okay. Robert Haslam was a real person, not a myth. He was an Englishman. He was part of the Mormon migration. He came to the American West when he was 16 years old. He was a fabled rider. There are actual accounts of him riding that appeared in newspapers at the time. There were people who, accounts that said he could get on and off the back of a moving horse, move the saddlebags and the saddle in 20 seconds or less, which might not seem like that's fast, actually. Try that at home.
That's very fast.
It is fast. He was a great rider, and the ride you're referring to was a ride he made at the height of the Paiute Indian War, which was in the 1860s. The Paiute Indians are on the warpath in what today would be Nevada and Utah. He rode 400 miles without relief. That would be like riding from Boston to Washington, D.C. Crossing 700 miles of Paiute Indian country on the back of a horse was a dangerous thing to do, hence the bonus. For riding.
Yeah,
a little account of this is Pony Bob Haslam riding. Turning to me, Marley said, "Bob, I will give you $50 if you make this ride." And I replied, "I'll go at once." Haslam left minutes later, armed with a 7-shot Spencer rifle and a Colt revolver with 2 cylinders. From the station onward, it was a lonely and dangerous ride of 35 miles without a change to the sink of the Carson River. Haslam made it there and rode on to Sand Springs. through an alkali bottom and sand hills, 35 miles farther, without a drop of water all along the way. He changed horses at Sand Springs and continued to Cold Springs, about another 30 miles farther down the trail. He changed horses again at Cold Springs and rode another 30 miles to Smith's Creek. Here I was relieved by J.G. Kelly. I had ridden 190 miles, stopping only to eat and change horses. Colonel Vischer claimed this run was the fastest on record for the entire route of the Pony Express. Haslam stayed at Smith's Creek for 9 hours, presumably sleeping. Then he started back down the line, heading west. When I arrived at Cold Springs, to my horror, I found that the station had been attacked by Indians, the keeper killed, and all the horses taken away. I decided in a moment what course to pursue. I would go on. I watered my horse, having ridden him 30 miles on time. He was pretty tired, and started for Sand Springs, 37 miles away. It was growing dark, and my road lay through the heavy sagebrush, high enough in some places to conceal a horse. I kept a bright lookout and closely watched every motion of my poor pony's ears, which is a signal for danger in Indian country. It was a cold night, late spring, and Haslam recalled hearing the mournful howls of wolves and coyotes as he rode west in the dark. The British explorer Richard Burton made the same observation later that year. Haslam reached Sand Springs safely, and he reported that the Cold Spring attack had occurred. He warned the station keeper at Sand Springs to come with him, fearing imminent Indian attack. The station keeper took his advice. One of the things about the memory of the Pony Express, which people often wonder about, is they'll say, because almost anybody knows the Pony Express, which is
or thinks they do.
Yeah, they do. People, and this is quite interesting. People who do not speak a word of English overseas in foreign countries will know the memory of the Pony Express. It has a kind of branding like Coca-Cola. It's one of those things that is iconic, and it has to do in part with how we came to remember the pony, which is what the book is really about in large part. The story itself would be inspiring and romantic, but the process of remembering the Pony Express is equally lively. Though the business only lasted a very short time and never made any money, it had the fortuitous luck to have involved with it a variety of people who you couldn't possibly have assembled a cast like this. In addition to Sir Richard Burton, who I mentioned, we have Mark Twain, Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, and lots of sort of bit players who sort of serendipitously had some kind of connection with the Pony Express. This is why we're even having this conversation about the Pony Express. Buffalo Bill probably played the greatest role possible in saving the memory of the Pony Express. He even claimed to have ridden for the Pony Express, although it would appear that that's somewhat dubious. But Alexander Majors had given Cody a job when he was a child. He was 11 years old. His father had died, so he gave him a job as a messenger boy for the freight hauling company. And when Cody started his Wild West show in 1881 in Omaha, Nebraska, he put the Pony Express in the show as a kind of skit. A pony rider would ride around the ring, they'd switch bags, it was a permanent fixture in the show. And from the day that show opened in 1881 in Omaha till the day it closed in 1916, at the time of the First World War, that's a long time.
Very long time.
The Pony Express was a permanent fixture in Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the World.
And we should give our viewers a little idea of what the Buffalo Bill show was like.
Yes.
There were a number of different skits.
There were lots of different acts. It was
involved.
A series of skits and sketches, riding exhibitions. Annie Oakley was shooting. She always was on the bill, or as long as she was affiliated with the show. There were lots of different things. But
Cowboys and Indians and Buffalo and so on and
rescuing, so forth. Rescuing people from a flaming stagecoach. Buffalo Bill would do this kind of thing, and then Indians would ride around the ring. It was
and the show toured constantly, right?
Constantly.
Spent a lot of time in Europe.
Toured in Europe, toured, which was very, very important to the memory of the pony, because people saw the pony. Queen Victoria came out of mourning to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West show because her son had gone to see the show and he thought it would be something she would appreciate. So people saw the pony who you wouldn't expect. The Pope saw the pony. And in the 19th century, the Pope was still almost a medieval personage in Vatican City who did not have the kind of public persona that we associate with the Pope today. Even the Pope saw Buffalo Bill's Wild West. So Buffalo Bill branded the memory of that on European and American minds. When Buffalo Bill got done with the Pony Express, people remembered the Pony Express. And you know, that had a great deal to do with it. Then, in addition to this, in the summer of 1861, having recently deserted the Confederate Army after 2 weeks of service, Mark Twain was crossing the American West with his brother. They were going to Nevada where his brother had a job. And Twain saw in western Nebraska, in Mud Springs, a Pony Express rider. The entire encounter took less than 2 minutes, and Twain took no notes of this event. But he got a couple of chapters of Roughing It out of this material. Twain played a huge role in capturing the memory of this. He called the Pony Express rider the swift phantom of the desert. And so you have Mark Twain and you have Buffalo Bill Cody. And then you have Wild Bill Hickok, who didn't play quite a significant enough role, but the interesting thing about him is Russell Majors and Waddell hired him to water the horses at Rock Springs in the territory of Nebraska. He's another one of these guys who, like, serendipitously arrives on stage. It's almost, you can't believe that all of these people sort of show up and have some kind of tangential role with the story.
Yeah, kind of coalesce into legend builders, as it were.
If you saw it as a movie, it wouldn't be plausible, you know? But it's the truth. So anyway, another factor that had a major role in the memory of the pony is that Americans were becoming literate in the 19th century, and the story of the Pony Express found its way into dime novels. The dime novelists begat Hollywood, okay? And it wasn't very long, even at the turn of the century, some of the earliest Western films ever made, silent films, were about the Pony Express, because it was this wonderfully popular image that people would be familiar with and could identify with, and it was, you know, men on horses and, you know, which is Westerns, and they were doing heroic things, so that got off to a pretty good start. I have to tell you that there is no representation of the Pony Express, to my knowledge, on film that is even remotely accurate. My favorite is 1953 Paramount, Charlton Heston and Forrest Tucker, a film called The Pony Express, which Heston plays Cody, Buffalo Bill, and Forrest Tucker plays, I think, Wild Bill Hickok, but that doesn't make any sense because they didn't really know each other that well. But the point is, the film doesn't have a shard of fact in it at all. It's set all over the place. All kinds of weird things happen. Jim Bridger, the trapper, appears at one point. But that didn't matter. It was a great story. And there's a long history of that, long history of that. None of those tales are true. The actual story would be a pretty good story if somebody were to bother to tell the story, but they seem to be more interested in the kinds of things that interested Colonel Vischer so long ago, the whoppers, you know? Yeah,
well, as I read this book, it struck me that it's really two stories. One of them is the historic story, the facts insofar as we can ascertain them. Because what was attempted was, as I said earlier, truly prodigious. And they pulled it off, although at great financial cost, and were ultimately transcended by the advent of the telegraph.
Yes, the telegraph put them out of business like that. They hadn't counted on the telegraph. The Creighton brothers, for whom one of whom Creighton University in Nebraska is named, were busily putting up the telegraph line across the country. But people said, oh, it'll take years or, you know, whatever. But the Creighton brothers were very crafty. It was like 120-something days. I forget the exact day. But, and part of that was they told their men, you don't want to be out here in the winter. So they worked literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, hanging the telegraph line. And the telegraph literally put the Pony Express out of business like that, one day. And notices ran in the California newspapers that said, our little friend the pony will run no more. In the world that we're in today, I think one of the things that still appeals to people about the memory of the Pony Express is, even in our politically correct times, where people are more sensitive about history than they might have been in the past, the Pony Express is essentially a benign memory of the American West, okay? It's not about the slaughter of buffalo or the decimation of the Indians or the exploitation of the land. It's about a young man on the back of a fast horse crossing the country.
Against overwhelming odds.
Exactly, day and night.
In a way, it's a mirror on ourselves. It's the way we would like to see ourselves, part of the American character, if you will.
That's true. The pony was the West as it might have been, or as it should have been. You know, people liked that memory. It was a memory of the West that Americans were comfortable with and were fond of. They reenact this ride every summer in June. The reason they don't do it in April, which is when the actual pony began, was because the terrain is too inhospitable. In fact, the curious thing is, in the 1920s, the United States Cavalry, and there still was a United States Cavalry, though not much of one, they attempted to reenact the Pony Express as a kind of exercise and as a sort of a stunt, and they couldn't do it. And they couldn't do it because they couldn't find people who could ride like that.
Chris, in your role as a professor of journalism here at UMBC, what would you like the reader to take from this book?
Well, you know, I'm not an historian. I mean, what I was really interested in here was what I thought was an American tall tale. This is a kind of the story of an American whopper. The reality is, I'm not sure that there's that you can really get to the bottom of this. So I think what I was mostly interested in doing was sort of celebrating the nation's affection for this kind of story, because America has a long history of appreciating the tall tale. You know, one of the things about writing this book, we're talking about research, is one of the things about this book is that in poking around the archives in the American West, I found things that had never been in print before about the Pony Express. I found a transcript of a deposition that was taken in Kansas in the 1930s of a very old lady who was a school teacher in Marysville, Kansas, who had been in Marysville, Kansas. That's 100 miles due west of St. Joe, first home station of the Pony Express. She was an eyewitness to the arrival of the first Pony Express rider, and we have no reason to doubt her account. She's not telling a story in a bar. She's not Buffalo Bill. She's not Mark Twain. She's just some little old lady who was a school teacher. So the fact is there were people in America well into the 20th century who remembered the days of the pony. And when you see something like that, it cheers you up, because you realize there is something, that this is really rooted in something too, you know. So I like the fabrications almost as much, Ed. All right.
Well, that's the journalism.
Yeah,
that's the journalist,
yeah.
professor of journalism speaking.
But,
Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
This book is a marvelous contribution to Americana and the way that we understand ourselves, and I think the hoofbeats of the pony will thunder on into history as America views its past. I'm Ed Beimfohr. Thank you for being with us today at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County.
Think Forward. Think Research Channel.